So I was researching a piece of land for the Waltham Land Trust up by Hardy Pond, and there was a guy named Thomas Loveran that had owned one of the pieces. So I stumbled across the story of Ruth Sawtell and Thomas Loveran accidentally while exploring the Middlesex County court records. These are available online on the Family History Library website. And actually, on your handouts, I have the original sources with the links. And actually, I think once we posted, and I think we may have sent out an email, it had the PDF, and the links are live on the PDF. So all you have to do is click on them. So I came across the fact that Thomas Loveran was in the court records. I soon realized that an alleged crime took place at Rock Meadow in 1674. Rock Meadow was originally part of the colonial Watertown settlement before original town boundaries were redrawn and to change and to form the town of Waltham in 1738 and the town of Belmont in 1859. So this 71-acre site of Rock Meadow was once in Watertown, Waltham, and Belmont. While the story of Ruth Sawtell and Thomas Loveran was interesting, I also discovered that Ruth Sawtell and her neighbor Zachariah Smith were connected to a murder 3 years earlier. And that murder ended up being a prelude and a contributing factor to the King Phillips War. Several historians have mentioned the murder of Zachariah Smith, but no one has connected all the dots, nor have they realized that the characters involved were, except the Native Americans, were all neighbors centered around the Mill Street, Trapelo Road area. In this presentation, I will describe the location of the Great Rock in Rock Meadow, introduce the three main characters, and describe the two crimes that occurred and their consequences. I would just have one caveat before we begin, that this presentation is intended for mature audiences. The subject matter contains references to extramarital relations, an out-of-wedlock birth, and the violence associated with King Philip's War. So the crime was premarital or extramarital sex between consenting adults was a crime in the 17th century in Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1630, the founders of Watertown were Puritans who had fled England to establish a Reformed church in America. They held strict beliefs about everyday life, citizenship, and sexual relations. By the mid-1600s, their children and grandchildren began to rebel against the strict code of conduct, and many tried to freely consort with one another. Think about teenagers, okay, and how they act. Ruth Sawtell and Thomas Loveran were accused of fornication in 1674, when their dalliance behind the Great Rock in Rock Meadow was discovered by a couple of neighboring teenagers, Richard Whitney and Jonathan Smith. So let's take a look at the environment, the neighborhood, and the families involved in this case. Rock Meadow is now a 71-acre conservation area located between Mill Street and Beaver Brook in Belmont. A glacier in this valley between Belmont Hill and Mackerel Hill deposited what the USGS calls coarse stratified deposits. Beaver Brook forms currently the southern boundary of Rock Meadow. But the name designation, Rock Meadow, applied actually to both sides of the brook in early colonial records. So this is a map. I don't know if I could, yeah, okay. And this is the Rock Meadow area here. This is Mill Street along here. This is Trapelo Road over here. And so Rock Meadow is currently on this side of Beaver Brook. Rock Meadow was within the boundaries of 17th century Watertown, within Waltham from 1738 to 1859, and in Belmont beginning in 1859. So it's part of the history of all three communities. When Europeans arrived in 1630, they identified the area as a meadow, likely maintained for centuries by Native Americans. 10,000 years ago, the glaciers that covered most of North America, and they began melting and retreating. As the glacier moved over the land, it deposited sand and rocks. It pulled sand and rocks with it. It also left larger rocks called glacial erratics. And as the mile thick bed of ice melted, streams formed at the bottom of the glacier, and they carried sand and rocks along the bottom. Those sand and rocks formed what they call glacial eskers. There are glacial eskers comprised of sand and gravel on the south side of Beaver Brook, and many people have walked along the tops of them. There's pathways there, and they actually get you up elevated over some of the wetlands below. According to Phineas Lawrence, in his 1858 History of Trapelo, Rock Meadow was named for the Great Rock. And this is possible because the rock also is called the Great Rock with capital letters in the 17th century court records. The early Watertown community divided the meadow into portions that served as they was three sources of hay. So it was an important farming piece of land. They used it for free hay and grazing. One of the original Watertown settlers, Ruth Sawtell, was allotted a 25-acre site in the Great Dividends, which bordered Rock Meadow. So here is a Google Street View, Google Satellite View from 2024, and I found what is a likely suspect to be the Great Rock at Rock Meadow. So here's Mill Street, and here's like the entrance to the Rock Meadow Conservation Area. Go down the driveway, and there's a parking lot down the bottom. And there's a whole system of trails throughout. And here are the Victory Gardens at Rock Meadow. And I believe this is a stream, and there's like some wet area down there near the parking lot. McLean Hospital owned the land for a while, and they had a piggery here. And the sort of foundation of the piggery building is there. So the way I got to Rock Meadow, which is not easy, by the way, at least now. So when you're walking up the trail here, there's a couple of clearings, one here, but it's the second clearing here. And there are beehives that are located on the other side of the trail around this area here, just to orient you. And I went in this part of the clearing there's kind of a pathway into the woods there. But then you really had to bushwhack my way through to the Great Rock. I just really kind of stumbled across it. In the 17th century, Middlesex County court records, the Great Rock was described as a half rod, which would have been 8.25 feet from Beaver Brook, and 60 rods, or almost 1,000 feet, from Richard Sawtell's house off Mill Street. This rock that I found measures 11 feet in height and 16 feet in width. Given its size and weight, the rock could not have been moved there, so except by the glacier, perhaps. In addition, its location matches the description of those. The Great Rock in the court records was described as being a half rod from the brook and 60 rods from Richard Sawtell's house. So this rock, in terms of its location, also matches those court records. And here I am in this picture in front of the rock, so you can estimate its size. As I said, I had to bushwhack my way there because the meadow is not mowed in that area, and there is no path leading to it. So I'm not surprised then that Belmont's consultants made no mention of it in their Rock Meadow master plan. The rock is visible on the state GIS maps from 2008 to 2023. And these are, I'm going to read them in case there's just someone listening, not watching, the GPS coordinates. It's 42.400144, I believe that's north, and 71.20101 west. And when I visited the Great Rock in the spring, it was a lovely spot next to Beaver Brook. And it would have been a nice place to visit if some of the brush was cleared away. I think these are like wood anemone at the base here. And I should mention that the brook in this area was channelized probably by the Kendalls for their map. There was actually a lawsuit in the 1850s regarding the Kendalls' right to, quote, flow the meadow, which means flood the meadow. And they were basically damming Beaver Brook and causing it to flood upstream. And the Browns, who lived in what's called the Shattuck House, sued, but Kendall prevailed on it. But you can actually, when you look down from the other side of the brook, you can actually see like stone walls where the brook was channelized. So this is the neighborhood that we'll be talking about. The story of Ruth Sawtell, Zachariah Smith, and Thomas Loveran involves three families who were neighbors in the Mill Street, Chapel Road area. Richard Sawtell, let's see if I can get this. Yeah, here. Richard Sawtell lived on the south side of Mill Street on lot number 8 in the 4th Squadron. So it's this piece of land here. Thomas Loveran had been the miller at the fulling mill at what is now called the Duck Pond at Beaver Brook Reservation. So here's Beaver Brook, in this area here. I don't know that the mill pond was actually dammed at that point. I think the duck pond was the only one that had been dammed in the 17th century. And then Thomas Smith, who was the father of Zachariah Smith, he lived on lot number 2 in the 3rd Division. And that is right near where Briarwood Road and Mallard Way are located. So the Great Rock was located along Beaver Brook up here near the confluence of these two brooks. And it's just down a little bit from the little bridge that goes over Beaver Brook from Rock Meadow. Richard Sawtell had been born in England, possibly in Somersetshire, and had immigrated to Watertown by 1636. So he was among the early English settlers of Watertown. He was married by 1637. He was allotted lot number 8 in the 4th Squadron when Watertown land was split up among the existing settlers. Lot 8 was along Mill Street, and his property would have been in the Stanley Road, Rock Meadow area. He may have been living there as early as 1649, when the town asked him to build a bridge along Mill Street. But he moved to Groton with other Watertown settlers, and he was the town clerk of Groton from 1662 to 64. He moved back to Watertown in 1665, and we know this because his wife was cited in the Watertown records for not attending Sunday services. According to the court records, his house was located 60 rods or 990 feet from the Great Rock. This would place the house around the area of the Victory Gardens. But so we don't know the actual route of Mill Street at that time. And I say that because in studying Chapel Road, I found that even though it does bend in places, it was a lot more winding before 1807 when they redid the whole road. So it's likely that Mill Street was also why they wound was that they went around environmental features such as rock outcroppings and wetlands. And furthermore, houses would have been situated near springs, wells, and streams, as a source of water. So Richard Sawtell and his wife had 11 children. His oldest son, Richard, died in the King Phillips War. His daughter, Ruth, who's the subject of this talk, eventually married John Hughes in 1677. And his son, Enoch, was the youngest and was a weaver, and he inherited his parents' estate. Thomas Loveran, the man accused of an illicit affair with Ruth Sawtell behind the Great Rock, was the nephew of Watertown settler John Loveran. Thomas had been born in 1626 in Waltham, England. He was apprenticed as a clothier at a mill at Dedham Lock in England. And this photograph here actually shows Dedham Lock and the mill there. It was done by John Constable. Thomas Loveran came to Watertown in 1664 when he purchased the fulling mill on Beaver Brook at what's now called the Duck Pond. So everybody knows that the mill was established in 1663 at the Duck Pond by Thomas Agar, and he was from Roxbury. But what I found was he only had it for a year, and then it was sold to Thomas Loveran. So one questions whether or not, for instance, did they bring Thomas Loveran over? Did they use Thomas Agar because he knew how to build a mill to build it and promised to let him use it for a year, and then they resold it? Who knows? But so Thomas Loveran took over the mill in 1664. He was married, but he was not married in 1674 when he was charged with the crime, because if he had, he would have been charged with adultery, which actually is a very severe punishment for that. In 1638, his uncle, John Loveran, died, and his widow remarried. So Thomas wasn't over here at that time, but when he did come over, he entered into an agreement with his uncle's widow to inherit some of the estate of his uncle, John Loveran. Thomas Loveran died in 1693. So Thomas sold the mill back to Timothy Hawkins in 1670, but it's unclear whether or not he continued to actually operate the mill after that. He certainly would have been in contact with the Sawtell family who lived next door on Mill Street. And actually, when I was researching the Beaverbrook Reservation, I found that there was a mill there almost continuously since 1663 until it burned down or a mill burned down there in 1849. So, in other words, places Thomas Loveran next door to the Sawtell family. Abutting the mill site on the west side was Thomas Smith, who was one of the early settlers of Watertown. He moved to this lot number 2 in the 3rd Squadron along Trapelo Road in 1651. And this area, as I mentioned, was occupied now by Briarwood Road and Mallard Way. The Edgar family, who ran a florist business in Waverly Square, lived on what was once the Thomas Smith property. So I don't know if people remember Edgar Florists, but and we certainly prowled around and traipsed through the Edgar property on our way with our ice skates to the duck pond. Thomas Smith had married Mary Knapp, daughter of William Knapp, and there's lots to talk about with William Knapp, who was not one of the best people in Watertown, let's put it that way. Among his children were sons Thomas, Joseph, John, Jonathan, and Zechariah, who we'll hear more about shortly. Zechariah was murdered allegedly by Native Americans in Dedham, Massachusetts in 1671. Youngest son, Jonathan, was one of the witnesses to the tryst at the Great Rock of Thomas Loveran and Ruth Sawtell. So you kind of question the veracity of some of the witnesses against them. And I should mention that of those sons, Joseph and John ended up moving up Trapelo Road to the Woburn Street area. One of them lived where Ricky Farms had been, and the other one was right at Woburn Street. And then Jonathan, our star witness, he owned land along Hardy Pond. And that's the Smiths of the Smith Street. And the descendants, one of them, they still lived on Smith Street. And one of them was my classmate in high school, Brenda Smith. Yeah. So, who still lived in the old Smith house on Smith Street. So let's get into the backstory about this. So Thomas Loveran and Ruth Sawtell were accused of fornication at the Great Rock in Rock Meadow in 1674. But this was not the first offense for Ruth. 3 years earlier, in 1671, Ruth, an unmarried woman, was pregnant, and the father of the child was her neighbor, Zechariah Smith. The punishment would have been fairly severe: 6 lashes and/or a fine, and perhaps even a forced marriage. Rhode Island was known to be more lenient, so we presume that Zechariah went on the lam heading for Providence. He traveled south, most likely on foot, and stayed overnight with Caleb Church at a sawmill in what was then Dedham, but it is now is Walpole. He started out the next morning after staying over with Caleb Church. He started out on the road to Providence. Not long after, 3 Native Americans discovered his body along the road near Wrentham, in actually what's now called Norfolk. And he had been killed by gunshot. So you know that it's a suspicious death. The murder of Zachariah Smith and the ensuing repercussions contributed to the outbreak of King Phillips War, one of the most disastrous wars in colonial history. So it's a little confusing. So we're going to do a timeline at this point. In 1671, Ruth Sawtell was pregnant out of wedlock by Zachariah Smith. They were likely charged with the crime of fornication. Zachariah Smith fled to Dedham and was murdered. Nehemiah or Ashcook, the son of Matunis, a Nipmuc sachem, was accused of the crime. And Nehemiah was tried in a colonial court, convicted of murder, executed by hanging, and then his head was placed on a pole on Boston Common, where it remained for 6 months. So this could not have pleased Matunis, the father. In 1672, Richard Sawtell, Ruth's father, successfully sued the Smith family and the estate of Zachariah Smith for child support. In 1674, Ruth Sawtell and Thomas Loveran were accused of fornication at the Great Rock in Rock Meadow. Jonathan Smith, the brother of Zachariah, was one of the accusers. In 1675, Matunis, the embittered father of the executed Nehemiah, led Nipmucs to join forces with Metacom or King Philip of the Wampanoag tribe and the Narragansetts in a war against the European settlers. In 1676, King Phillips War ended with the destruction of 50% of the New England villages, a near annihilation of the Native American population in southern New England. In 1677, Ruth Sawtell married John Hughes of Scituate, and they lived in Watertown and later Lexington. Ruth died in 1720, and she is buried in the old burial ground in Lexington. So I have several questions about the so-called crime of fornication between Zachariah Smith and Ruth Sawtell. Marriage of the couple could have resulted in a more lenient punishment. So why did Zachariah flee rather than marry Ruth? Was Ruth going to claim, for instance, that she was raped? This would have entailed the death penalty if that were the case. Had the Smiths and Sawtells been feuding previously? Unfortunately, there are not enough written records to answer our questions. We do know that the punishment for fornication was harsh: forced marriage, 6 lashes, or a fine. Rhode Island had more lenient laws, so Zachariah may have fled to avoid the harsher penalty. Let's take a closer look at the murder of Zachariah Smith. He fled to the part of Dedham that was later called Walpole. And this is a map of the colonial post roads of New England. And the lower post road was originally a series of Native American pathways. And parts of it actually are included in what's now Route 1. And as you can see here is the Dedham. Here's Watertown here. Here's Dedham. And then Walpole would have been around in this area. And then the Wrentham and Norfolk were in this area here. So he was right along the southern post road that goes somewhat straight to Providence. Dedham was founded in 1635 by people from Watertown. Here's a map showing the original boundaries of Dedham superimposed on a current map. So the blue line shows the original boundaries of Dedham. So it included a lot of other towns the current day towns. Zacharias stayed over at a sawmill in what is now Walpole, which I've highlighted in yellow. And he was murdered along a road at what is now Norfolk in near the Walpole boundary. And Norfolk at that time was actually part of Wrentham. Wrentham was established at that time. Sawmills had important functions in growing communities such as Dedham, because for the construction of buildings and roofs, ships, bridges, and fences. Cedar was especially valuable for its weather-resistant properties. A sawmill was established on the Neponset River in 1659 by Joshua Fisher and Major Eliza Lutcher. And in 1664, Thomas Clapp became the owner. Caleb Church ran the mill on the Neponset beginning in 1669. Caleb Church was the son of Richard Church of Hingham and the brother of Benjamin Church, who was an important military leader in the King Phillips War. Caleb Church's daughter, Rebecca, married Joshua Warren of Watertown. And Joshua Warren lived on the Warren property that was we now call Arrigo Farm on Warren Street. So that Warren property actually dates back to the Warrens claimed in 1632. Zacharias Smith fled Watertown, probably intending to go to Providence, Rhode Island. As I said, he stayed overnight at the Dedham Sawmill on April 12, 1671. He headed out the next morning on April 13th on the old Southern Post Road. Shortly after he left, 3 Native Americans were seen traveling on the same road towards Wrentham, although the witnesses at that time claimed that they were dressed as if they were from the Wampanoag tribe. And that same morning, other Indians came running up the road from the Stop River to report the murder by gunshot of a white man, Zacharias Smith. So here's a 1794 map of what is now Walpole, showing the sawmill over here on the right. Get this mouse to show. Here we go. Here's the sawmill over here. And the Southern Post Road that goes and crosses the Stop River here. So the road crossed the Stop River, which is on the border of Walpole and Norfolk. Norfolk was then part of Wrentham. So he was actually killed near the Stop River. Here is the location of the sawmill along the Neponset River in what is now the Walpole Town Forest. This is a Google satellite view from 2024. There's a bridge here, it's called the White Bridge, going over the river where the sawmill is believed to have stood. It's quite a lovely spot now, and the remnants of a later mill over here on the right, you can see the foundation stones at the bridge. There was a later mill there as well, and those are still there. And as I mentioned, it's the Walpole Town Forest. It's a lovely place to go walking. And here is from Google Maps, West Street in Walpole, and it becomes Main Street in Norfolk, and it crosses the Stop River. And Zacharias Smith's body was found near that spot. Zacharias Smith was found murdered on April 13th, 1671, a few miles from the sawmill in Dedham, Walpole, where he had spent the previous night. No one witnessed the murder, and 3 Native Americans were seen walking along the same road shortly before. Ascook, or his English name Nehemiah, was accused, tried, and hanged for the murder of the crime of murder. So Ed Ascook was a Nipmuc. He was not a Wampanoag. So historian Samuel Drake claimed that the evidence was insubstantial against him. Ascook's head was placed on a pole on Boston Common. Ascook was the son of Nipmuc sachem Matunis, who by 1675 was living in the praying village at Packagug, which is now the site of Holy Cross College in Worcester. The execution of his son embittered Matunis, so that in 1675, Matunis led other Nipmuc sachems to join forces with the Wampanoags and Narragansetts against the English settlers of southern New England. And I should mention on your handouts there's a link to a YouTube film that was done by Holy Cross and people from the Nipmuc community about the settlement of Packagug. Now, the thing is, Packagug was established as what they call a praying town by John Eliot in 1674. So, and Matunis then lived in that Packagug settlement, but we don't know where Matunis lived before they moved into the praying towns. Matunis and his forces attacked Mendon in July of 1675. This was one of the first battles of King Phillips War that followed the Wampanoag attack on Swansea and Rehoboth. He later joined with another Nipmuc sachem in the ambush of colonial forces at Brookfield, and he was eventually captured, and he was executed by firing squad in Boston in the fall of 1676. And his head, too, was put on a pole. King Philip's War was one of the most devastating wars in American history. 600 English soldiers were killed. 50% of the colonial settlements in Massachusetts were heavily damaged or destroyed. And Native Americans in New England suffered thousands of deaths and enslavement, and most of their villages were destroyed. So once they lost, many of them were sent as slaves and sold as slaves in the Caribbean. Others were then rounded up, and they went to what essentially was a concentration camp on Deer Island, where they died of malnutrition and exposure. After the murder of Zachariah Smith, who was the father of Ruth Sawtell's baby, Ruth's father, Richard, sued the estate of Zachariah Smith for child support. Richard Sawtell alleged that Zachariah had 21 shillings in his pocket when his body was found. John Warren and Samuel Stearns tried to negotiate a settlement between the Sawtells and the Smith family. And Thomas Smith, as I mentioned, was the father of, and I think was the executor of the Zachariah Smith estate. But they were not able to come to an agreement, so they went to court. Witnesses testified that they had paid Zachariah for work. So Thomas Smith was basically trying to show that Zachariah had money on him, and he was trying to claim that money. The verdict of the jury was for the plaintiff, Richard Sawtell, and he was awarded 19 shillings and child support. The lawsuit may have initiated some bad feelings between the Smiths and the Sawtells, who were neighbors. In fact, the two families may have had a contentious relationship even before the death of Zachariah. So let's jump ahead to 1674, when Ruth Sawtell and Thomas Loveran had a tryst behind the Great Rock. There was a wedding at the Phillips Shattuck household, which was located near or at the current site of the Josiah Shattuck house at the intersection of Concord Ave, Mill Street, and Winter Street. I've looked at the deeds for Phillips Shattuck, and he mentions about 6 acres, which was a typical size of the land holdings at Rock Meadow. And in his probate, he mentioned that those 6 acres, some of them were in West Cambridge, because although the Josiah Shattuck house is entirely in Belmont now, it was actually right over the border before Belmont was formed. It was right over the border in West Cambridge. So there was a wedding at the Phillips Shattuck household. And the court record actually mentions in the lawsuit that Richard Sawtell had, the court record mentions that the two witnesses, Jonathan Smith and Richard Whitney, Moses Whitney, were going to this wedding at the Shattuck house. And it was the marriage of William Shattuck and Susanna Randall. And so that wedding occurred on May 22nd, 1674. Susanna Randall and her father, Stephen Randall, lived on Mill Street near the Shattuck house and the Sawtell house as well. So the Randall house was located on the east side of Mill Street, but set back from the road and up the hill on what is now the McLean property. Stephen Randall, as I mentioned, lived on Mill Street. The two teenagers, the witnesses, Jonathan Smith and Moses Whitney, were cutting through the woods from the Thomas Smith household on Chapel Road. Jonathan was the brother of Zachariah Smith. Smith. Moses Whitney was the son of Richard Whitney. As they were crossing Beaver Brook on a fallen log, and that's something that we used to do actually before the bridge was built. When we were kids, we used to cross the brook over to Rock Meadow on logs. And I actually have fairly recently in back of Neil Hickey's house, Mike Hickey's house. But Mike doesn't like people doing that now. So when they crossed the log and went on to Rock Meadow, they spied a horse tied to the bushes at the Great Rock. As they approached the rock, Moses Whitney claimed he saw Thomas Loveran pulling up his breeches and hiding behind the rock. He also said that he saw Ruth Sawtell lying on the ground with her petticoats up around her knees. Jonathan Smith said he saw the couple, but that his view was blocked by Moses. So Jonathan's kind of waffling about this. Neighbors George Lawrence lived right on the other side of the Smith property, and George Lawrence's house was at the corner of Marlborough Road, where the De Vincents lived, and so neighbors George Lawrence and Richard Whitney, the father of Moses, went to investigate the scene, and they found that the plants around the rock had been flattened. But under cross-examination, they conceded that this could have been caused by an animal. Thomas Loveran and Ruth Sawtell were subsequently charged with fornication. This would have been the second offense for Ruth. The case went to court in April of 1675. Thomas admitted that he was at the Great Rock, but denied the charge of fornication. Ruth did not appear in court, and officials could not find her anywhere in Watertown. So Ruth went on the lam, probably because a second offense would have resulted in a very harsh penalty. So we don't know where Ruth fled to, but about 2 years later, she married John Hughes, a poor weaver from Scituate. So she was spoiled goods at this point, in those days. She was considered spoiled goods, and she would not have been able to marry someone high-born. So she married a poor weaver. They lived in Watertown for a few years, but then they moved to Lexington, and they lived up in the Bedford Street area of Lexington. They had 4 children, and Ruth lived to 1720 when she died at the age of 70 years. She was buried in the old cemetery in Lexington, and her gravestone still stands there today. The stone reads, "Here lies the body of Mrs. Ruth Hughes, wife of Mr. John Hughes, age 70, who died January 12th, 1720. We don't know the actual facts behind the 2 cases involving Ruth Sawtell, Zachariah Smith, and Thomas Loveran. Given that Zachariah fled rather than marry Ruth, and that Thomas was almost 20 years older than Ruth, perhaps Ruth's participation was not consensual. Ruth was able to return to the community not long after the charges against her. So perhaps there was a tacit belief of extenuating circumstances, or they may have doubted the veracity of the witnesses. These underused court records have added to our knowledge of Watertown, Waltham, and Belmont history. The macrous history of Josiah Shattuck's house begins with its construction in 1750, but deeds and court records have located an earlier Shattuck house nearby in 1670. Witness accounts in the court records have identified the actual date of the Shattuck-Randall marriage in 1674. Lemuel Shattuck, who's written the definitive history, Shattuck history, and I should mention so Lemuel Shattuck was one of the founders of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I used to work there. And there is actually a huge painting of Lemuel Shattuck and his family on the wall there. But he and subsequent historians never discovered these court records, and they erroneously placed the marriage date at 1678. But as I mentioned, the 2 teenagers were headed over to the Shaddocks in 1674 to attend that marriage. Many historians have failed to identify Zachariah Smith within his community or recognize the relationships of the Smith and Sawtell family in Watertown. So there's lots of historians that have talked about Zachariah Smith and his murder and its impact on the development of the King Phillips War. And even Roger Thompson had it wrong also. I hesitate to say that because I did know Roger Thompson and knew how much work he's written and studied on Middlesex County history. So our knowledge of the early settlement of the families on Trapelo Road has consolidated this narrative of the 1671 murder of Zachariah Smith, and which was a contributing factor to the King Phillips War. So this basically pulls together a lot of the information that other historians have not been able to figure out. Because the land was already a meadow in 1630, Watertown and Belmont histories have inferred that Rock Meadow had been maintained by Native Americans before the arrival of the European settlers. Trapelo historian and farmer Phineas Lawrence stated in 1858 that Rock Meadow was actually named for the Great Rock. And the rock is associated with 17th century events and may have been a lover's meetup place. So perhaps we could, call it Fornication Rock or something like that. And it could end up being a teenage meetup place, even to this day. But the Great Rock is hidden and it's nearly inaccessible due to the dense brush around it. Its location next to Beaver Brook could be a lovely woodland retreat. And I proposed to the town of Belmont that it recognize the history of this natural monument, establish a path to the rock, and perhaps clear some of the brush around the rock so people could see it a little bit better. So with that, I'm winding up our history of the Great Rock. And I guess so it's almost impossible in the summertime to get back there, as I said, because there's so much brush. I know, Victoria, you were able to find it. So it's best visited after the leaves are off the trees so that you can get through the brush a little bit easier. And if you kind of go to the clearing, and we figured out there's like 2 fir trees that you can see in the distance, and you kind of head towards those. And there is GPS coordinates as well. So I didn't find a lot of poison ivy back there. So it's, it's not dangerous at all, but you do have to climb over fallen trees, etc., to get to it. So